Ready to act. It is unconscionable. I yield back.
Gentleman from Michigan yields back. Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Madam Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to my friend and colleague, the great member from Mississippi, Mr. Palacio.
Gentleman from Mississippi recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank Chairman Smith and Chairman Rogers for their work to put this bill together. This is a product of months of work on the part of our appropriators under regular order to give us the framework for this bill. I have the pleasure of serving as chairman of the subcommittee on space as well as being one of the lead sponsors on the underlying indemnification bill. This is a simple yet crucial policy that allows our space industry to remain globally competitive as they support and service satellites Americans rely upon every day. I welcome this 3-year extension, and I also appreciate the consideration this package has given my NASA reauthorization bill. The larger package also begins to address issues facing homeowners across the nation, not just in coastal areas, by including the Palazzo-Cassidy-Grimm-Richmond amendment that has received wide bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate. This provision halts all FEMA work through the end of this fiscal year to implement rate increases on some of those homeowners affected by flood map changes. This provision sets the stage for broader reforms that we are working towards later this month or the next. With this bill, we also maintain our commitments to our men and women in uniform by restoring damaging defense cuts. We address cost of living adjustments for 63,000 medically retired military personnel and survivors receiving those benefits. I plan to continue working to address cost of living increases for all of our military retirees. We provide for a well-deserved 1% increase in troop pay, and it also provides funding for Homeland Security priorities such as the 7th and 8th National Security Cutters for the Coast Guard. Finally, this bill continues the pattern of responsible cuts to government waste, fraud, and abuse. It represents $165 billion in total discretionary cuts since 2010 and is part of our commitment as House Republicans to continue cutting spending responsibly. Again, I thank my colleagues for their work on this bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
The gentlewoman from California, Ms. Waters, who is the ranking member of the Financial Services Committee.
Gentlelady from California recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. While this agreement is an improvement over the harmful sequester, it fails to adequately fund Wall Street's costs, shortchanges many housing programs, and ignores the global economy. While the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Commodity Futures Trading Commission need more resources to oversee Wall Street, this bill only provides flat funding to the already underfunded SEC and a nominal bump for the CFTC. Yes, no furloughs, but no new examiners either. Regarding housing, the bill offers minimal increases for Section 8 vouchers and the Community Development Block Grant Program, but not enough for Americans struggling with long-term unemployment and foreclosure. Finally, Republican isolationists have excluded the International Monetary Fund reform package. Democrats and business agree. A well-equipped IMF that leverages billions of global dollars is our national interest. Despite these concerns, we must pass this bill. Reluctantly, I support this bill. We have to stop the sequester and prevent another government shutdown. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Oklahoma.
I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Oklahoma reserved. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Madam Speaker, I'm happy to yield to the gentleman from California, Mr. Swalwell, for a unanimous consent request.
Gentleman from California.
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to bring up H.R. 3824 to end the Republicans' refusal to extend unemployment benefits that protect 238,855 and counting workers in my home state of California.
Gentleman's advised that all time has been yielded for purposes of debate only. Does the gentleman from Oklahoma yield for purposes of this unanimous consent request? The gentleman from Oklahoma does not yield. Therefore, the unanimous consent cannot be entertained.
Madam Speaker, I yield to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Kildee, for a unanimous consent request.
Is the gentleman from Michigan?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I ask unanimous consent to bring up H.R. 3824 to end the Republicans' refusal to extend unemployment benefits that protect 49,965 workers in Michigan.
Does the gentleman from Oklahoma yield for the purposes of a unanimous consent
No,
request?
Madam Speaker, I do not.
Gentleman does not yield. Therefore, the UC cannot be entertained.
Madam Speaker, I yield to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, for a unanimous consent request.
Gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to bring up H.R. 3824 to end the Republican majority's refusal to extend unemployment benefits that would protect 137,315 workers in my home state of New York, and that number is growing as we speak.
Does the gentleman from Oklahoma yield for purposes of the unanimous consent request?
No, Madam Speaker, I do not.
The gentleman does not yield from Oklahoma. Therefore, the unanimous consent cannot be entertained.
Madam Speaker, I yield to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, for a unanimous consent request.
Gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I ask unanimous consent to bring up H.R. 3824 to end the Republicans' unconscionable refusal to extend unemployment and benefits that protects 137,315 workers in my home state of New York.
Does the gentleman from Oklahoma yield for purposes of a unanimous consent
No, Madam
request?
Speaker, I do not.
The gentleman from Oklahoma does not yield. Therefore, the unanimous consent cannot be entertained.
Madam Speaker,
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
I'm happy to yield to the gentleman from Nevada, Ms. Titus, for a unanimous consent request.
Gentleman from Nevada.
I ask unanimous consent to bring up H.R. 3824 to end the Republicans' refusal to extend unemployment benefits that protect over 19,000 workers in Nevada.
Does the gentleman from Oklahoma yield for purposes of this unanimous consent request?
No, Madam Speaker, I do not.
Gentleman from Oklahoma does not yield. Therefore, the unanimous consent cannot be entertained.
Madam Speaker, I yield to the gentleman from California, Mr. Takano, for a unanimous consent request.
Gentleman from California.
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to bring up H.R. 3824 to end the Republicans' refusal to extend unemployment benefits that benefit over 250,000 people in my home state of California.
Does the gentleman from Oklahoma yield for purposes of this unanimous consent request?
No, Madam Speaker, I do not.
Gentleman from Oklahoma does not yield. Therefore, the unanimous consent cannot be entertained.
Madam Speaker, I'm happy to yield to the gentlelady from New Hampshire, Ms. Shea Porter, for a unanimous consent request.
Gentlelady from New Hampshire.
Ask unanimous consent to bring up H.R. 3824 to end the Republican leadership's refusal to extend unemployment benefits that protect unemployed workers in my state of New Hampshire.
Does the gentleman from Oklahoma yield for purposes of this unanimous consent request?
No, Madam Speaker, I do not.
Gentleman from Oklahoma does not yield. Therefore, the unanimous consent cannot be entertained.
Madam Speaker, for the purpose of unanimous consent request, I yield to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Roybal Allard.
Gentlelady from California.
I ask unanimous consent to bring up H.R. 3824 to end Republicans' refusal to extend unemployment benefits that protect 238,855 workers in California.
Does the gentleman from Oklahoma yield for purposes of this unanimous consent?
No, Madam Speaker, I do not.
Gentleman from Oklahoma does not yield. Therefore, the unanimous consent cannot be entertained.
Madam Speaker, I'm happy to yield to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Loretta Sanchez, for a unanimous consent request.
Gentlelady from California.
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to bring up H.R. 3824 to end the Republicans' refusal to extend unemployment benefits that protect 238,855 workers in my home state of California.
Does the gentleman from Oklahoma yield for purposes of this unanimous consent request?
No, Madam Speaker, I do not.
The gentleman from Oklahoma does not yield. Therefore, the unanimous consent cannot be entertained.
Madam Speaker, I'm proud to yield to the gentleman from Massachusetts, my colleague, Congressman Kennedy, for a unanimous consent request.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I ask unanimous consent to bring up H.R. 3824 to end the Republicans' refusal to extend unemployment benefits that protect nearly 63,000 workers in Massachusetts.
Does the gentleman from Oklahoma yield for purposes of this unanimous consent request?
No, Madam Speaker, I do not.
The gentleman from Oklahoma does not yield. Therefore, the unanimous consent cannot be entertained.
Madam Speaker, I yield to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Eshoo, for a unanimous consent request.
Gentlelady from California.
I thank my colleague and the Speaker. I ask unanimous consent to bring up H.R. 3824 to end the unfortunate Republican refusal to extend unemployment benefits that protect 238,855 workers in my home state of California.
Does the gentleman from Oklahoma yield for purposes of this unanimous consent request?
No, Madam Speaker, I do not.
The gentleman from Oklahoma does not yield. Therefore, the unanimous consent cannot be entertained.
Madam Speaker, I yield to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Waters, for a unanimous consent request.
Gentlelady
Mr. Speaker,
from California.
I ask unanimous consent to bring up H.R. 3824 to end Republicans' shameful refusal to extend unemployment benefits that protect 238,855 workers in California, my state.
Does the gentleman from Oklahoma yield for purposes of this unanimous consent request?
No, Madam Speaker, I do not.
The gentleman from Oklahoma does not yield. Therefore, the unanimous consent cannot be entertained.
Madam Speaker, I yield to the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford, for a unanimous consent request.
Gentleman from Nevada.
Thank you for yielding. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I ask unanimous consent to bring up H.R. 3824 to end Republicans' refusal to extend unemployment insurance benefits that protect 19,285 workers in the great state of Nevada.
Does the gentleman from Oklahoma yield to this unanimous request?
No, Madam Speaker, I do not.
The gentleman from Oklahoma does not yield. Therefore, the unanimous consent cannot be entertained.
Madam Speaker, I'm happy to yield to the gentleman from California, Mr. Ruiz, for a unanimous consent request.
Gentleman from California.
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to bring up H.R. 3824 to end the Republicans' refusal to extend unemployment insurance that protects 238,855 workers in California who lost their job through no fault of their own and who actively seek work.
Gentleman from Oklahoma yield for purposes of this unanimous consent request.
No, Madam Speaker, I do not.
Gentleman from Oklahoma does not yield. Therefore, the unanimous consent cannot be entertained.
Madam Speaker, I yield to the gentleman from California, Mr. Cardenas, for a unanimous consent request.
First, the Chair would make a statement. The Chair would advise members that even though a unanimous consent request to consider a measure is not entertained, embellishments accompanying such requests constitute debate and will become an imposition on the time of the member who yielded for that purpose.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I ask unanimous consent to bring to this floor H.R. 3824 to end Republicans' refusal to extend unemployment benefits that protect families in the San Fernando Valley, of which I represent. These individuals deserve the right to eat and should not be tossed out on the street and become homeless.
Does the gentleman from Oklahoma yield for purposes of this unanimous consent request?
No, Madam Speaker, I do not.
The gentleman from Oklahoma does not yield. Therefore, the unanimous consent cannot be entertained. Time will be charged to the gentleman from Massachusetts for the last request.
Madam Speaker, I yield to the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Frankel, for a unanimous consent request.
Gentlelady from Florida.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I ask unanimous consent to bring up H.R. 3824 to end the Republicans' very cruel refusal to end unemployment benefits that would protect more than 80,000 Floridian job seekers, my home state of Florida.
Does the gentleman from Oklahoma yield for purposes of this unanimous consent request?
No, Madam Speaker, I will not.
The gentleman from Oklahoma does not yield. Therefore, the unanimous consent cannot be entertained.
Madam Speaker, I yield to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Brownlee, for a unanimous consent request.
Gentlelady from California.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I ask unanimous consent to bring up H.R. 3824 to end Republicans' refusal to extend unemployment benefits that protect nearly 239,000 workers in the great state of California.
Does the gentleman from Oklahoma yield for purposes of this unanimous consent request?
No, Madam Speaker, I do not.
The gentleman from Oklahoma does not yield. Therefore, the unanimous consent cannot be entertained.
Madam Speaker, I yield to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Cartwright, for a unanimous consent request.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to bring up H.R. 3824 to end the Republican refusal to extend unemployment benefits that protect 80,473 workers in my home state, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania.
Does the gentleman from Oklahoma yield for purposes of this unanimous consent request?
No, Madam Speaker, I do not.
The gentleman from Oklahoma does not yield. Therefore, the unanimous consent cannot be entertained.
Madam Speaker, I yield to the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Maloney, for unanimous consent request.
Gentlelady from New York.
I ask unanimous consent to bring up H.R. 3824 to end the majority's refusal to extend unemployment benefits to some of our nation's neediest families, including 137,315 workers in the great state of New York.
Does the gentleman from Oklahoma yield for purposes of this unanimous consent request?
No, Madam Speaker, I do not.
The gentleman from Oklahoma does not yield. Therefore, the unanimous consent cannot be entertained.
Madam Speaker, I yield to the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline, for a unanimous consent request.
Gentleman from Rhode Island.
Madam Speaker, in the hopes of a different response from my friend on the other side of the aisle, I ask one more time for unanimous consent to bring up H.R. 3824 to end the Republicans' refusal to extend unemployment benefits that protect 5,585 workers in my home state of Rhode Island.
Does The gentleman from Oklahoma yield for purposes of this unanimous consent request.
My good friend on the other aisle clearly hasn't dealt with a lot of Native Americans, so the answer is normally pretty much the same. So, Madam Speaker, I do not yield.
The gentleman from Oklahoma does not yield. Therefore, the unanimous consent cannot be considered.
Madam Speaker, for the purpose of the unanimous consent request, I yield to my colleague from Massachusetts, Mr. Tierney.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I move unanimous consent to bring forward H.R. 3824 to end the Republican unconscionable refusal to extend the unemployment insurance, which in my state would benefit some 62,900 workers in search of work.
Does the gentleman from Oklahoma yield for purposes of this unanimous consent request?
No, Madam Speaker, I do not.
The gentleman from Oklahoma does not yield. Therefore, the unanimous consent cannot be entertained. Gentleman from Oklahoma.
I want to thank my friend for giving me the opportunity to renew so many acquaintances with my good friends on the other side and make some new ones. So I appreciate that. But I want to reiterate my earlier announcement that all time yielded is for the purpose of debate only, and we're not yielding for any other purposes. I would like to make the point, this legislation is genuinely bipartisan. The legislation my friends have asked for consideration was not within the scope or consideration of this legislation. I have no doubt it's being dealt with in the Senate right now. But simply not appropriate, in my opinion, to bring it into this debate, particularly since we're under time constraints, and were we to fail to pass this rule and the underlying legislation in a timely fashion, we would risk the government shutdown, which I know my friends on the other side of the aisle want to avoid as much as we do. So with that, I'll reserve the balance of my time, Madam Speaker.
Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Yeah, Madam Speaker, let me just say to my colleague from Oklahoma, we're not asking that we amend this bill. We're asking for the right to be able to bring up a bill that would extend unemployment insurance. And let's be clear, so everybody understands this. The majority, if they agreed, could allow us to bring this up at any time. We could have this debate right after we pass the omnibus. So there's absolutely no reason at all that we shouldn't have the right to be able to debate the issue of extending unemployment insurance to millions of our fellow citizens who are looking to us for help. You know, it is very difficult in this economic during these economic difficulties to be able to find employment, and we have many of our citizens who have tried but have been unsuccessful in finding employment. They ought to be able to support their families through this difficult time, and all we're asking for is the right to be able to bring this up and vote on it. We're not talking about delaying passing the omnibus bill. We're talking about unemployment insurance. We're talking about doing our job and not skipping town and going home for a week while people who are unemployed, who have lost their benefits, have nothing. With that, Madam Speaker, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Massachusetts who, if we defeat the previous question, we could bring up his legislation to extend unemployment insurance to the millions of Americans who have been impacted.
Gentleman from Massachusetts for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, some 1.3 million workers have lost their jobless benefits as of December 28th. That number grows by an estimated 72,000 more a week, and in my home state of Massachusetts alone, some 62,915 families have been adversely impacted, and that includes 20,000 veterans. We can hear the urgency of families who have exhausted every avenue, they've exhausted their savings, the generosity of family and friends, even as they look for work. About 4 million people have been cut out of work for 27 weeks or longer, and they have about a 12% chance of finding a new job in any given month. There still aren't enough jobs to go around, almost 3 unemployed workers for every job opening. That's worse than the ratio at any point during the 2001 recession. If the fate of individuals doesn't move the members of this chamber, perhaps a look at the economy would. For every $1 of unemployment insurance, the economic impact is a positive $1.52. That's money with which to buy essential services and products of our local small businesses who greatly need that demand. 17 times over the last decade or so, we've extended benefits in a bipartisan manner. 14 of those times were bipartisan in nature, and 5 of those were under the administration of George W. Bush. The urgency is now. The need is critical. I've introduced, Madam Speaker, the responsible legislation titled the Emergency Unemployment Compensation Act, H.R. 3824. It has over 140 co-sponsors already, even though it's been filed only a matter of days. Speaker Boehner should bring this bill to the floor immediately for a vote. Let's act now and extend it for 3 months, help our neighbors, help themselves as we help our nation. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to remind my good friend that this legislation comparable to this is actually under consideration in the United States Senate right now. And frankly, my friends on the other side of the aisle control the majority there. I would also like to remind them that when the President first raised this issue, about a week before the end of the year, the Speaker said, if you'll help us find a way to pay for it, then we'll consider it. So far, I don't recall that that offer has been taken up in any serious way by anybody. The cost of this is extraordinary, $25 billion over a year. Temporary 3-month extension would cost between 7 and 8. We're trying to deal with what have been really deficits that have been extraordinary. This program has been extended for 5 years. 5 years. So, again, we'd love to continue our dialogue with our friends. We hope something productive happens in the United States Senate. But for now, I'm going to keep the focus where it belongs. That's on this omnibus spending bill, which is a bipartisan accomplishment, which the President has urged that we pass, and which I know many of my friends on the other side also favor. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Madam Speaker, before I yield to the next speaker on our side, I think it's important to point out that, yeah, we do control, the Democrats do control the majority in the Senate, but a minority of Republicans right now are filibustering consideration of extending unemployment insurance, led by the minority leader, the Republican minority leader, Mitch McConnell. And so, you know, maybe rather than waiting for them, we can show some leadership here and demonstrate to these millions of Americans who have fallen on tough times that somebody cares, that we're not just going to let them just dangle and be without any kind of compensation during these difficult times, that we're going to step up to the plate and let them know that we understand that the economy is still going through hard times and that there is a need to extend this benefit. I mean, I don't know how we could just turn our backs on these people who are struggling. I mean, our job here is to help people, not to ignore their problems, not to turn a cold shoulder when they fall in difficult times. I mean, we all know this has been we're emerging from one of the worst economic crises in our lifetime. These aren't normal times. So we ought to be there to provide some help. Let's show a little compassion. I don't think that that's unreasonable. I don't care what your ideology is. We ought to not turn our backs on those who are unemployed in this country. And with that, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford.
Gentleman from Nevada, recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank my colleague for yielding. I urge my colleagues to vote no on the previous question, so we finally have a chance to bring up unemployment insurance, which is what a majority of Americans want us to be addressing at this time. It is completely insensitive, unjust, and flat-out wrong that Congress would deny 1.4 million Americans unemployment insurance benefits, including over 19,000 Nevadans. And this is the week that unemployment checks stop coming. This is the week where families will be faced with very unnecessary hardships and impossible choices. Why? Because this Congress fails to act. Republicans are holding unemployment benefits hostage, and it's completely hypocritical. On December 14, 2002, in his weekly radio address, then President George W. Bush scolded Congress for failing to extend unemployment insurance benefits. He said, these Americans rely on their unemployment benefits to pay for their rent, to pay for food and other critical bills. Will the gentleman yield another?
Additional 30 seconds.
Gentleman's recognized for an additional 30 seconds.
To pay for their rent, to pay for their food and other critical bills. They need our assistance in these difficult times, and we cannot let them down. The unemployment rate then was 6%. It's much higher now. That Congress voted 416 to 4 to extend unemployment benefits, and under George W. Bush they did it 5 times, and they didn't ask for one pay for because it was important for the American public. It's time for us to do the right thing on behalf of 1.4 million Americans. I yield back the time.
Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield to myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you very much. want to remind my friends, and I have no doubt about my friends' compassion. I genuinely do not. We've had the opportunity to serve together on the Rules Committee. I would argue the compassionate thing to do here would be actually start creating some jobs. This recession ended in 2009. It's been a lot of years. We have 140 pieces of legislation stacked up in the United States Senate waiting for the Senate to act on it that we think would generate jobs, everything from Keystone Pipeline to enhanced energy protection, but there's a disagreement. But I think if the Senate would act proactively, would actually do what I know we both want to do and create jobs. The other thing I would suggest is, look, I have some sympathy with my friends on the other side of the rotunda in my party. They've not been allowed to present any of their ideas or any of their amendments on the floor. I think they would probably like to work with our friend in that regard. So let's just see. But again, I would suggest today we should concentrate on the thing that we know we can do in a bipartisan fashion. Pass an omnibus spending bill that will prevent a government shutdown, that will provide a firm foundation for our economy, and that both sides and the President of the United States has agreed is the right thing to do for the country. You usually make progress one step at a time. It seems to me that's an important step, and a step that we ought to make today by passing the rule and the underlying legislation at the appropriate time. I will not yield. With that, I yield back, or reserve, excuse me, the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
And I appreciate the gentleman from Oklahoma's comments, and I appreciate you know, his expressing the frustration of the minority in the Senate not being able to express themselves and be heard. I feel that same frustration here because we are now have just completed a year in which I think that there have been more closed rules given this year than any other time in history. So I think we all on the minority side here understand what it feels like to be shut out. At this point, I'd like to yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Roybal-Allard.
Gentlelady from California, recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, the low level of funding in the omnibus bill for the Labor HA subcommittee is far from meeting the needs of our country. Nevertheless, I will support the bill because this compromise measure does make important improvements in health promotion, medical research, Head Start, and Job Corps. I commend Ranking Members Lowey, DeLauro, and their staff who passionately fought to protect the critical programs decimated by sequestration. I am particularly grateful the bill fully funds stop-back programs so we can continue the progress we've made against the public health crises of underage drinking. And I am pleased it funds newborn screening programs that save the lives of babies with genetic disorders. Madam Speaker, spending bills are a statement of our values and our priorities as Americans. Unfortunately, this bill falls short of truly reflecting those values in critically underfunded programs like Healthy Start and Hispanic-serving institutions. My hope is that our 2015 appropriations bill will, in fact, reflect our commitment to investing in a better future for all Americans, including the most vulnerable among us.
Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Far be it for me to debate too much about what goes on in the United States Senate, but I do think it's worth adding for the record that since July of this year, Republicans in the Senate have been allowed to submit exactly 4 amendments. So I think we know who holds the world's record in terms of keeping a minority off the floor. With that, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to my distinguished friend, my colleague, my former chairman on the Interior Committee, and the new chairman of the Energy and Water Subcommittee on Appropriations, the gentleman from Idaho.
Gentleman from Idaho for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman. And, Madam Speaker, I rise to enter a colloquy with the gentleman from California, Mr. Nunes, and the gentleman from California, Mr. McCarthy. I would yield to the gentleman from California.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for all your hard work in putting this bill together. Mr. Chairman, the underlying bill includes 3 environmental funds that have had very little accountability since they were enacted, specifically the Central Valley Project Improvement Act Restoration Fund, the CalFed program, and the San Joaquin River Restoration Fund. I remain concerned about the expenditures in these programs and whether they are going for the intended purpose. I urge the committee to conduct an oversight hearing into these programs and would urge you, Mr. Chairman, perhaps you could contact the Government Accountability Office to conduct a study of these programs run by the Bureau of Reclamation's Mid-Pacific region.
I would yield to the gentleman from California, Mr. McCarthy.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for your work, and I appreciate your willingness and opportunity to bring the accountability. As many of you know, the challenge that we have in California and the devastation of the drought, but what is wreaking havoc throughout the valley, which is the breadbasket. We find many times much of this money is not being held accountable, and the lack of water that is not being supplied throughout California. We appreciate your work on this.
I thank both my gentlemen, both of my friends from California, and for their attention to these issues. We have been discussing these issues with both of you and your concerns for some time now, and I look forward to exploring the issues further during a hearing and to working with Government Accountability Office to provide further oversight of these programs. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The Chair will receive a message.
Madam Speaker, a message from the Senate.
Madam Speaker,
Madam Secretary.
I have been directed by the Senate to inform the House that the Senate has agreed to H.J. Res. 106, a joint resolution making further continuing appropriations for fiscal year 2014 and for other purposes.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to yield to our distinguished minority whip, Mr. Hoyer, for a unanimous consent request.
The distinguished minority whip is recognized.
I thank the gentleman from Massachusetts for yielding. Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to bring up H.R. 3824 to end the Republicans' refusal to extend unemployment benefits that protect 25,092 people in my state of Maryland.
The Chair would advise the distinguished minority whip that we understand the gentleman from Oklahoma has not yielded for that purpose. Therefore, your request cannot be considered. Where am I going? Massachusetts? Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Madam Speaker, at this time I'd like to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Cuellar.
Gentleman from Texas for 1 minute.
I thank the ranking member for yielding, and Madam Speaker, I want to thank Chairman Rogers and Ranking Member Lowey for their hard work on their funding on this funding package, and specifically their help in adding a first-time accountability provision to make our federal government more efficient and more effective. This accountability language will, for the first time, direct each agency head in preparing funding requests as part of the President's annual budget in consultation with the GAO to directly link the agency's performance plan and performance goals to such funding. It will require that performance measures examine outcome measures, output measures, efficiency measures, and customer service measures. This will provide the American taxpayer with results-oriented government. This first-time accountability language represents a real step forward for the integration of the performance-based budgeting and government operations, and I thank you and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Madam Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Madam Speaker, I'm happy to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Kildee.
Gentleman from Michigan for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to the gentleman from Massachusetts for yielding. I'm here to express my disappointment that we are not bringing up H.R. 3824, a bill that would extend for 3 months emergency unemployment compensation, and it causes me to think of what the American people would expect of us here in Congress if we were facing a national emergency of some type that resulted in the immediate loss of basic support for the basic needs for 1.3 million Americans. What would we do, especially if that national emergency somehow caused every week 72,000 additional Americans to lose the basic help that they need to provide rent, to provide heat, to put food on the table, to take care of the basic human necessities? We would act. Sure, as the gentleman pointed out, we would discuss ways to prevent future national emergencies that would cause this sort of problem. We would find ways to prevent those sorts of things from happening. And the gentleman referred to job training or economic development programs like job training. We would do those things for sure, but in the meantime, we would, and today we should act to restore those benefits. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Madam Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Madam Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Maloney.
Gentlelady from New York, 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, I commend Chairman Rogers and Ranking Member Lowey for their tremendous leadership in putting together this compromise budget. The bill is a step forward. It increases funding for many important priorities like housing, authority operations, Section 8. We've got an affordable housing crisis in New York City, and these additional resources will help. The bill also makes important infrastructure investments. It fully funds the President's request of $14.6 million for the 2nd Avenue subway in the district I represent, and $215 million for the East Side Access that will help create thousands of jobs in our nation's largest city and is in the district of Mr. King and my district. I am also pleased to see that there isn't a single anti-woman rider that would threaten women's access to comprehensive health care. This bill isn't perfect, but it's a step forward. I had hoped it would increase and would include an extension of unemployment insurance and refund the cuts for the National Institute of Health, but it is a vast improvement over the current budget, and I will be supporting it. Thank you.
Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Madam Speaker, I continue to reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Madam Speaker, I yield to the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Eddie Bernice Johnson, for a unanimous consent request.
Gentlelady from Texas.
Thank you very much. I ask unanimous consent to bring up H.R. 3824 to end the Republicans' refusal to extend unemployment benefits that protect over 72,000 workers in Texas. Yield back.
Chair understands that the gentleman from Oklahoma has not yielded for that purpose. Therefore, the request cannot be entertained. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Madam Speaker, I'd like to yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline.
Gentleman from Rhode Island, 1.5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Madam Speaker, in the last 18 days, nearly 1.5 million Americans have been cut off from their emergency unemployment benefits, and tens of thousands more Americans will lose their benefits every week without congressional action. Yesterday, the Wall Street Journal reported that 2.3 million children live with a long-term unemployed parent, triple the number since the recession started in 2007. And losing unemployment benefits will be devastating to so many of these families. This is unconscionable. And what have my Republican colleagues in the House done to address this issue? Nothing. Speaker Boehner's refusal to have a vote to extend emergency unemployment benefits is short-sighted, bad for our economy, and devastating for the 1.5 million Americans who have been cut off from this vital lifeline. Congress is set to adjourn in 24 hours, and instead of offering a solution to extend emergency unemployment benefits, this rule does not allow us to preserve this important assistance and ignores the serious needs of our constituents. It's outrageous that the House of Representatives would leave town again without taking action to renew this critical program to help struggling American families. I urge my colleagues to defeat the previous question so we can bring this important legislative fix to the floor without delay to resolve this problem for our constituents. I thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I remind my friends on the other side of the aisle that supposedly we're in the 5th year of a recovery and that we have extended these extraordinary benefits for 5 years at the cost of hundreds of billions of dollars. Now, the Speaker has indicated that if our friends, either the administration, our friends on the other side of the aisle, our friends in the Senate, have an idea of how to pay for this extension, he would give it due consideration. So far, it doesn't appear that such an idea has been forthcoming. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Madam Speaker, let me just remind my colleagues that Republican President George Bush extended unemployment benefits on a number of occasions, never paid for it. I don't recall my friends on the other side of the aisle raising a big to-do over that. But the bottom line is that to simply say that, well, we've extended it multiple times, so tough luck to these people who are still struggling in this difficult economy is unacceptable. How can we do that? I mean, we're here to represent these people, to make sure that they have enough to get through these difficult times until the economy gets better so they get a job. I mean, this should not be controversial. This shouldn't be a big deal. I mean, I'm stunned that extending unemployment insurance to the unemployed in this country is a controversial issue, only in this Republican-led House of Representatives. I mean, our priorities are all messed up. Nobody talks about pay-fors for tax cuts for Donald Trump or subsidies to big oil or any special deals for corporate donors to the Republican National Committee. No one says a word about that. But when it comes to extending benefits to unemployed Americans, we've got to find pay-fors. Well, you know what? Let's take the initiative in this House to figure out how to get this thing done rather than leave town tomorrow and we don't come back for a week and a half and just leave these people hanging. With that, Madam Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks.
Gentleman from New York for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. While I intend to support the omnibus appropriation bill, I wanted to voice my deep concern and disappointment that the omnibus appropriation bill fails to address the unemployment insurance issue, as well as it fails to address the rising flood insurance premiums facing millions of those who've been impacted by Superstorm Sandy. Rather than amend the Bigot Waters Flood Insurance Act in a comprehensive way, the omnibus contains language that temporarily delays flood insurance premium increases for a year and for just a segment of policy owners. After that year, flood insurance premiums could continue to rise exponentially for newer policies. This is crippling our housing market recovery in areas like New York City, New Jersey, Connecticut, and others that were hard hit by Superstorm Sandy. Though this temporary delay may be better than nothing, it is not the certainty that the nation's 5.5 million flood insurance owners deserve and need. Again, I call on Congress to bring up a comprehensive flood insurance reform legislation quickly in order to provide economic certainty to at-risk neighborhoods across our great country. I yield back the remaining balance.
Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Madam Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Madam Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Fatah.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman. I want to thank the chairman and ranking member on the House Appropriations Committee. I want to speak in support of the underlying matter, the appropriations bill. There is a lot that I could say, a lot of progress that we've made on a number of issues, but I want to, at this moment, talk in particular about the investments we're making in science and innovation. World Economic Forum says that the American economy is an innovation-driven economy, and throughout this appropriations bill at NASA, at NIST, in terms of our federal laboratories, and across a whole spectrum of activities, including DARPA and others, we are making significant investments. I want to say that working with Chairman Wolf over the last 3 bills that we have moved to this floor and through the process, we have launched a high-priority research effort on neuroscience or brain research, and we've added to that each year, and this bill is no exception. We work now in this legislation to internationalize this collaboration in important ways because the EU and others have launched similar initiatives in terms of understanding the complexities related to the human brain and diseases and disorders therein. So I thank the chair and the ranking member, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Madam Speaker, could I inquire from my friend if he has any additional speakers?
I do.
In that case, I'll reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
I yield to the gentlelady from Connecticut, Ms. DeLauro, for a unanimous consent request.
Gentleman from
I thank
Connecticut.
the gentleman. I apologize for being late. I ask unanimous consent to bring up H.R. 3824 to end the Republicans' refusal to extend unemployment benefits that protect over 26,000 workers in my state of Connecticut.
Stands that the gentleman from Oklahoma has not yielded for that purpose. Therefore, the request cannot be entertained. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
And I will be the last speaker on our side, so if the gentleman wants to proceed.
Gentleman from Oklahoma.
I thank my friend. Madam Speaker, in a few moments I'll offer an amendment to the rule. The amendment's necessary due to a late request submitted by the administration to ensure that the fix for disabled military retirees works as it was intended. The amendment was fully vetted by the relevant House and Senate committees, majority and minority, and the administration. The Congressional Budget Office has confirmed that the change does not affect the cost of the bill. This amendment will ensure that we properly execute the agreed-upon compromise. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Madam Speaker, I yield myself the remaining time.
And the gentleman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, just to kind of summarize here, my colleagues are being asked to vote on this, over 1,500 pages that nobody has read. Again, coming from the party that talked about reading the bill, I'm a little surprised that they wanted to present it this way. But I'm urging my colleagues to vote no on the rule simply because under the process that we have before us, nobody has an opportunity to amend anything in this bill. or change anything. And I'm willing to bet that probably in a week or so we're going to read an article about something that was in here that nobody even knew about. But yet, if they did, they would have wanted it out of the bill. So I think the process that my Republican friends have utilized in this House of Representatives really is very disappointing. The number of closed rules, the way they have shut down debate, and even the way we have gotten to this point. So I would urge my colleagues to vote no on the rule. The underlying bill, I mean, at the end of the day, people are going to have to vote for this bill anyway, because the alternative is shutting the government down or going back to the sequestration levels which my Republican friends embraced, which were unacceptable, so unacceptable they couldn't pass a transportation appropriations bill on this House floor. They couldn't bring an HHS bill to this floor because the numbers were so unacceptably low that even their own members couldn't deal with voting for a bill like that. But as far as the underlying bill goes, I guess the best that can be said about it is that it begins to chip away at sequestration. The numbers are still awful, but the alternative is even worse. I would also urge my colleagues again to vote no on the previous question so that we can bring up a bill to extend unemployment insurance for those who are unemployed. I'm fascinated by the debate on the other side of the aisle saying, well, we're reluctant to do it because we've done it a number of times. That seems more important to my Republican colleagues than whether or not people are in need, whether or not it is necessary to extend these benefits to keep families afloat. You know, because Congress failed to act, more than 1.3 million struggling unemployed Americans were cut off from extended emergency unemployment benefits in the middle of the holidays. We all went home for Christmas, and the gift we gave to these struggling Americans was we cut off your unemployment compensation. Another 1.9 million Americans will lose this support in the first half of this year if we don't do anything. So too many families are still struggling to rebuild and regain what they had before the economic crisis. It's both unfair and devastating to cut off these benefits at a time of a 7.0% unemployment rate. We should not leave Washington tomorrow on a Thursday and go home for a week and a half and not address this issue. And to blame the Senate, maybe it's an easy way to kind of just brush this off, but the bottom line is in the Senate, if you want to be of any help, talk to the minority leader who's leading a filibuster so that this can't be brought up over in the Senate. But that's no excuse for us in the House not to act. That's no excuse for us to turn our backs on millions of Americans who desperately need our help. They're going through difficult times. Our job here is to help people, not just those who are well off, not just those who have super PACs or who write out checks to campaigns. Our job is to help everybody, and that includes those who are most vulnerable, those who are struggling during this difficult economy. Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to insert into the record an editorial that appeared in the New York Times entitled "No Jobs, No Benefits, and Lousy Pay."
Without objection.
I'd also like to ask unanimous consent to insert into the record an article entitled "New Economic Analysis: $400 million drained from state economies and unemployment benefits this week alone."
Without objection.
You know, by not extending unemployment benefits, we are not only hurting these families who are unemployed, we are hurting our local economies. We are hurting the economy of this country. We need to get our priorities straight here. Our job is to stand up for those who are in need. And on too many occasions, this Republican-led House has turned its back on those who are most vulnerable. And so I would urge my colleagues, both Republicans and Democrats, to vote no on the previous question. This is our only opportunity before you go home on a recess to be able to deal with the issue of extending unemployment insurance. Vote no on the previous question so we can bring up the extension of unemployment compensation so we can help millions of families in this country who are desperately in need of help. With that, I yield back my time.
Gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from Oklahoma.
Madam Speaker, I yield to myself the balance of my time.
And the gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, in closing, I would again like to thank my friends, Chairman Rogers and Ranking Member Lowey, on their their efforts to bring an important product to this floor, a product which fulfills our constitutional responsibility of appropriating funds for the government for the fiscal year 2014. And while this is not the bill I would have drafted, or I'm sure that my friend would have drafted, I believe it strikes an appropriate balance between key Republican and Democratic priorities, and I believe it will attract the majority of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, as well as the majority of my friends on my own side of the aisle. I want to thank my friend in the sense that while we've had a contentious debate, we're actually going to be on the underlying legislation voting together. That might have gotten lost in the debate. And I'll be voting with this, with, again, the majority of his colleagues and at the urging of the President of the United States. So we ought to recognize, while we've had some partisan differences here, the legislation itself was crafted in a bipartisan manner. It was brought to this floor. I would agree with my friend. I would have preferred 12 different bills and a lot more time, but we've got a limited time frame here. It was brought in a cooperative manner, both the ranking member and the chairman urging its passage. So it's something we ought to take, frankly, some pride in, and certainly congratulate those who had laid their hand in it. I want to also point out to my friend on the unemployment issue, here we probably do disagree, but the Speaker's made it apparent if there are appropriate pay-fors, he's willing to consider that. And without questioning my friends on the other side of the rotunda, you know, so far they just simply haven't provided that. I think the Speaker's offer has been out there for quite considerable time, just before the end of the year, before the benefits ended. It's also worth noting that this does not affect regular unemployment benefits. Those are still there for all Americans. This is a program that's been extended 5 years. We're now in a time when the recession is 4 years in the rearview mirror and unemployment's been coming down. If it still needs to be extended for some people, we ought to find a way, in my view, to pay for it, and I think the Speaker's made it apparent that he would consider any serious proposal in that regard. So far, we haven't had that. Sometimes, Madam Speaker, the smart vote and the easy vote are the wrong vote. I know some of my friends on the other side, you know, might decide to vote no on the underlying legislation. I never quibble with a rule vote. I respect that process. Because there's, from their perspective, a lot to criticize here. And there's certainly, from my side of the aisle, a lot to criticize as well, and we're going to have some no votes. But I think there's not much question that the right vote here is to vote for the underlying legislation, assuming the rule's adopted, and I think it will be. And I think it's the right thing for the country. I think it's the right thing for the process itself to actually get back to regular order, to consider the bills in the manner that I know my friend would like them to be considered in, and to have an open amendment process, which we do on appropriations legislation. This is an essential first step to doing that. I think that Chairman Rogers and Ranking Member Lowey have probably done more in this legislation to restore the process and rebuild upon it. They've given us a foundation for the next fiscal year that will allow us to do precisely the things that my friend would like to do and that I agree in a normal process ought to be done. So I would obviously urge support for the rule, but more importantly, after the rule passes, assuming it does, for the underlying legislation, so that we can work together in a bipartisan fashion. We can make sure we have no government shutdowns next year. I think that will actually do more to create jobs and economic certainty than probably any single thing we could do. Our Appropriations Committee, working in a bipartisan fashion under the leadership of Chairman Rogers and Ranking Member Lowey, has done that. I would suggest it's probably something that all of us should reflect upon, congratulate upon, and then try to spread throughout the institution. If we work the way they worked in putting this bill together and bringing it to the floor on every other piece of legislation, I think the country would be well served, and frankly all of us would have a great deal to be proud of. So with that, again, I urge the passage of the rule and the underlying legislation, and I yield back. Madam Speaker, I do offer an amendment to this resolution.
And the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Cole of Oklahoma. Page 2, line 6, after Rules Committee Print 113-32, insert, as modified by Section 6 of this resolution. At the end of the resolution, add the following. Section 6. The modification referred to in the first section of this resolution is as follows. Page 363. Strike lines 12 through 16 and insert the following. 1. Combat-related special compensation. Section 1413A, B3 of Title 10, United States Code is amended. A. In subparagraph A, by inserting, with adjustment under paragraph 2 of Section 1401AB of this title, to which the member would have been entitled, but without application of paragraph 4 of such section, under any other provision of law, and B. In subparagraph B, by striking whichever is applicable to the member, and inserting with adjustment under paragraph 2 of Section 1401AB of this title, to which the member would have been entitled, but without the application of paragraph 4 of such section, whichever is applicable to the member.
Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time, and I move the previous question on the amendment and on the resolution.
The question is on ordering the previous question on the amendment and on the resolution. Those in favor will signify by saying aye. Opposed will say no.
No!
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, the ayes have it. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
I'm going to ask for the yeas and nays.
Yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having arisen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. And pursuant to Clause 9 of Rule 20, this 15-minute vote on ordering the previous question will be followed by 5-minute votes on adopting the amendment, if ordered, and adopting the resolution, if ordered. This is a 15-minute vote, a 15-minute vote.
Well, at long last, the House finally begins debate on the fiscal year 2014 omnibus spending bill, the bill that will fund the federal government through the end of this fiscal year, the end of September. This is a 15-minute vote, previous question vote. They'll vote on the rule next, and if that passes, there will be an hour of general debate, a final vote likely by the late afternoon, and we'll have it all for you here live on C-SPAN. We also want to open up our phone lines to get your thoughts on what you just heard in terms of the debate over the past hour. In particular, some of the comments on unemployment by Democrats in particular. And we're going to open up our phone lines for Democrats. The number is 202-585-3885. Republicans, 202-585-3886. And all others, 202-585-3887. You can also send us a tweet. That's C-SPAN chat is the hashtag. And during our conversation, we're joined by Chief Congressional Correspondent for the Washington Examiner, Susan Ferriccio, up on our studio in Capitol Hill. First of all, Susan Ferriccio, this omnibus spending bill looks like it's going to be smooth sailing. Are there any sorts of roadblocks that it may encounter either here in the House or in the Senate?
Other than just sort of procedural stuff, you might hear of complaints from Democrats that the unemployment insurance is not included, or that some of the spending isn't high enough on the domestic front. But this really is smooth sailing in both chambers. This has been, as you just said, kind of a long process to get here. We're already in the fiscal 2014 year. We are 3 months in. They started this in October. As everyone might remember, there was such a battle over spending levels that there was a government shutdown that lasted 16 days. It led to very intense negotiations that in December resulted in a deal that paved the way for what we're seeing today, which is sort of just putting the details into the plan that Republicans and Democrats agreed upon. And that was the spending cap, $1.012 trillion. That's the bill they're going to talk about today. It breaks down into spending for each agency, all 12 pieces of appropriations legislation, and it also addresses overseas war spending, and it's a lot of money all tucked in one bill. This is a 1,500-page bill. It also includes some what we call legislative riders, stuff that's not really directly related to federal spending, but they kind of catch a ride on this legislation and get put into law. And that's something both Democrats and Republicans inserted into this legislation. Things like preventing the Obama administration from enforcing the new light bulb standard for energy efficiency, or preventing the release in the United States of Guantanamo Bay prisoners. Things like that were included for both parties. There's increased funding for Head Start, NIH is getting some extra funding. Everyone's getting a little bit from both parties, and that's one reason why this will make it through fairly easily. But the second really big reason is that neither party is anxious for another government shutdown, because the public really didn't like that. So that's why I believe by the end of this week, this will be a done deal and the President will have signed it into law.
Well, on the issue of unemployment, the extension of emergency unemployment insurance benefits, we heard debate on the House floor from Democrats in particular. A couple of tweets from our viewers. Steve says 1.4 million long-term unemployed agree. Republicans are cold and heartless. Clancy, on the other hand, says another political stunt. If unemployment insurance is so important to Dems, why didn't they include it in the budget? You've been over in the Senate a bit today and yesterday. What's the status on the unemployment insurance bill over there?
The status is gridlock, and the reason is neither side can agree on how to pay for this. It's a lot of money. Just a few months' worth of extension, 3 months, is almost $6.5 billion. To do it for the entire year, you're talking about more than $25 billion. So it's a lot of money. There's a rule in Congress that they need to pay as they go, so they try to stick to that rule. They can waive it, but that's difficult to do. So they're right now negotiating on how to pay for it. They've been going back and forth on this for a few days now, and they have not reached an agreement. I was just speaking to some of the chief negotiators over in the Senate who are telling me that they're waiting for basically the Majority Leader Harry Reid to make a move, that they feel like on the Republican side they've put forward what they feel is their best offer. And now I know that Harry Reid has said he feels he's put forward his best offer. So they don't have an agreement on the pay-fors, and they're also bickering over who gets to amend the legislation. That's when the legislation is being debated on the floor and you can tack things onto it. Republicans would like to introduce some amendments concerning that new health care law. While Republicans, of course, don't want anything like that coming to the floor, Democrats, it will be politically difficult for their members. So there's a battle going on over amendments and how to pay for this legislation. So at this very moment, we don't have a deal. So it can't even really apply to the House at this point if the Senate can't get something together. It needs to clear both chambers in order to become law. So right now we're pretty much stuck on unemployment. Our guest is Susan Ferricchio. She's chief congressional correspondent for the Washington Examiner. The vote on the floor, one of the procedural votes on the omnibus spending bill. More debate ahead. Let's go to our first caller, Lancaster, California. And this is Glenn on the Independence line.
I got a good one. Emergency unemployment insurance. How about if we stop all visas because 40% are overstaying? We got American people, American citizens that need jobs. We don't need amnesty. We need to protect the American citizens. That's emergency unemployment insurance. Send all the illegal workers home, protect American citizens, and in turn it'll fix our hospitals, our schools, and everything.
On to Jacksonville, Florida. James, go ahead. You're on the air.
Hi. I just wanted to call about the unemployment. I think it needs to be passed. I've been working for 30 years, and my unemployment ended on December 28th. And there's no jobs. I know that the majority said that the everything got better in '09, but that's not right. Not here in Florida. Things are not better. There's over 1.4 people unemployed, and 2 million children come from that.
Well, Susan Ferricchio, in terms of the legislative work on that, as Democrats tried to get Republicans to bring that to the floor, what have Republican leaders said about any initiation of unemployment insurance legislation in the House?
That's right. The Democrats would like to see it on the House floor. The Speaker of the House, John Boehner, actually, in my view, seems fairly open to the idea of passing an extension of these benefits. He said so several times, but he is couched it in a way to insist on ways to, not only ways to pay for this legislation, which of course you would expect from Republicans, but they would also like to add to the whole discussion, inserting, some new legislation or provisions that would, in the Republicans' view, improve our economy and create jobs. So those would probably be more Republican initiatives having to do with tapping our energy resources here. So I think that, again, you're leading down a pathway to more divide, where I think Republicans would be open to doing this. but they would want to pay for it, and they might want to include provisions that maybe Democrats wouldn't be so keen on. So I don't think that precludes it from happening in the House. I think if the Senate is able to pass something, sometimes that puts pressure on the other chamber, even if it's the opposite party, to try to get them going, because we really don't, Republicans aren't eager to be painted as uncaring or not concerned with all the millions of people who are unemployed and the 1.4 million who need these benefits, because that number will grow every week. So, you know, in a few weeks there'll be 1.6 million, so that will also add pressure here. So I think it may not happen at the moment. I think it's still very possible, and if they do pass something, it's likely to be retroactive. So people who lost their benefits beginning after December 28, 2013 are likely to recover some of that money. So that's something to keep in mind, too.
Let's go to Monterey, Massachusetts, and Leslie on the Republican line.
Yes, I'm calling in regards to unemployment as well. I was laid off from work at my newspaper when they outsourced to India. And I've worked all my life. I'm a widow, and I think it's just inhumane to allow us to continue to suffer. I think, Susan, you cover your facts really quite well. Excuse my nervousness, but I'm looking at no money for rent, no help, and I think let's find ways to pay for this after we have compassion on these American citizens that have worked all my life. I've worked, and I was happy to help others.
And Leslie, what was your job at the newspaper?
Newspaper advertising. All the creative work, all the ads that are done now are all done in Pune, India. So little mom and pop grocery stores are having their ads done in India. I think, why can't Bank of America, 5 times the amount, why can't money come from these people to help out? It's just so unbalanced.
All right, from Massachusetts, Susan Ferricchio, any thoughts?
Yeah, it's interesting how this discussion extends kind of into the whole situation in America about job creation right now. And we hear so much discussion in Congress from both parties and both chambers about ways to create jobs, ways to bring jobs back to the U.S. There's a really deep understanding here about this outsourcing and about industries fading out, like the newspaper industry, as I can personally attest to, having been a long-time newspaper reporter, and then other technologies coming to the forefront. You know, we get into job training issues, which I know Republicans have talked about and Democrats have talked about. They've talked about ways to attract companies to come back to the U.S. through tax incentives. Those things, I think both sides feel an urgency there to do it. They haven't been able to agree on it. It's one of the things I think is terribly frustrating, both to observers and people out there who are just living this on a daily basis. I mean, the unemployment insurance is helpful to people because in most states, the states offer about approximately 26 weeks, and it varies on whatever state you're in. So this federal benefit that has expired has been a real lifeline to people who have had a very hard time getting back into the workforce. And as evidence of that, look at the long-term unemployment rate. It's people who, there are many people who simply dropped out because they've expired both state and federal, and they're not looking anymore. That number has been alarmingly high and hasn't come down much. So it shows the economy, you know, something's not right here. And I will tell you, people in Congress know that. They just can't agree on how to fix it.
President Obama speaking about manufacturing and jobs today in North Carolina. We covered that. That's available in our video library at cspan.org. Also later in our schedule, the President this afternoon also announcing a new head of the Small Business Administration, and look for coverage on the C-SPAN networks. On the House floor, they're in the previous question vote ahead of a vote on the rule for the last bit of debate on this omnibus spending bill funding the federal government through the end of this fiscal year, the end of September 2014. And we say good afternoon to Chata in Hurst, Texas on the independent line.
Hi there. My name is Chata, and I am calling from Fort Worth, Texas. What is so frustrating to me is I have been unemployed for 8 months. I worked for Bank of America. They laid me off. I'm in the mortgage business. I'm 59 years old. I'm not a deadbeat. I have looked for work continuously. Like I said, I was in the mortgage business. There are no jobs out there in mortgage. Bank of America's laid off, Citibank's laid off, all the mortgage companies around here. That's all I know.
Well, Chata, thanks for your call. Let's tie that into the spending bill, Susan Ferricchio, in terms of money for regulation for the SEC, for the enforcement of Dodd-Frank in particular. How do those agencies come out in this spending bill?
I think overall there's money for this enforcement, and I think what you're going to see, at least from just listening to economists talk, is that the economy is recovering, but it's just not recovering fast enough. So you're hearing things from like the previous caller, who is still, you know, the housing market has seemed to be on the recovery path, but it's been slow, and it's been sort of one step forward, two steps back. And also, I will say, in terms of what the last caller was talking about, there's a reason the mortgage industry has struggled, and in part it is because of enforcement and Dodd-Frank, because it's much harder for people to get loans. The rules are much stricter now, which is good because we want to keep, you know, everyone who deserves a loan and can pay for a loan, you want them to have access. But it's making it loans further and farther between, so people are fewer and farther between, so that mortgage lenders are not getting nearly the business that they were getting during the boom years when so many people got into the business and were hired. So it's not surprising to hear this from people in the mortgage industry, that they can't find work. The loans just aren't out there anymore. The business isn't there. And it's a whole new world in the real estate market just because of the crash, and because Dodd-Frank has put these very important and serious rules in place that make the hurdles much higher for people who need loans and for lenders who are trying to provide the money.
At the beginning of our conversation, you mentioned the policy writers, the few policy writers that are in this 2014 spending bill. One of them dealt with light bulbs. In fact, in your Washington Examiner piece, you write about that. The light bulb extension, light bulb provision, rather, will do little to bring back the popular, inexpensive incandescents. What's in there, and what does it mean?
It's really interesting. This is something that's been floating around for a couple years now up here, and it's a provision that prevents enforcement. Every now and then you see one party or the other sneak this into legislation where they're trying to stop, or they can't repeal a law, they can't find a way to repeal something,
right.
So they might try to stop. And we've seen Republicans do this with the health care law. We just won't fund it. That's one level of control that the opposition can have. That's what you have here with the light bulb standard. It's something that was passed into law, signed by George Bush in 2007, and it aimed at improving efficiency of light bulbs. The public, of course, has clamored for these old incandescent-style bulbs. You know, you just go on eBay and you'll see the fight over them. They're hard to find now in supermarkets. So, you know, the other night when the bill came out late, Twitter was lit up with people going, wait, does this provision mean I can go and buy my favorite light bulbs again? That's not exactly the case, because it doesn't repeal the law. It prevents funding for enforcement. But for the most part, the light bulb industry has been very supportive of the 2007 light bulb standard, in part because it's a little more profitable for them. So they've already kind of done away with these incandescents, and there are, I don't think, any more factories in the U.S. that produce them, because the law has a chilling effect, whether or not it can be enforced with the money taken away by Republicans. However, you know, people still want these bulbs, and they're, you know, it's confusing because you read about a provision like this in the bill and you think, yeah, well, can I go out and buy them? Not quite the case, though.
All right, let's get back to calls. A couple more calls on the spending bill, the unemployment issue. Let's hear from Suitland, Maryland. Reginald's on the Democrats line.
How you doing today?
Doing fine, thanks.
That's good. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, I'm calling in regards to the Republican, the Democratic employment opportunities in Maryland.
You know what, Reginald, you're got to turn down your television. I'm gonna put you on hold for a sec. Turn down your TV, and we'll get back to you in a second, or you'll confuse yourself there. This is Barbara. She's in Russell Springs on our Republican line. Is that Russell Springs, Georgia?
No, it's Russell Springs, Kentucky.
Okay, go ahead, Barbara.
Yes, I was calling on the unemployment extension myself.
Yeah.
I am one of those people praying for it to go through. I think that the Congress has a stereotype that we're all lazy people sitting around on the couch. But actually, I think that you'll find that it's a lot of people that are in their 50s and 60s that have been laid off from companies because they get on up there, you know, and then it's getting into benefit time, and they lay them off, and then they turn around and hire younger people for lower pay. And it's been going on for a really long time. And it's not just a matter of walking into a company and then applying, you know, for a job. Everything is done over the internet now. And I feel like that I'm getting buried in the emails, you know, sending applications through the internet, and I never get any responses back from any of those people. And it's just a lot harder right now, and I beg them.
And Barbara, how long have you been unemployed?
I have been out of work for a year and a half now, and I was in a highly special field.
Yeah.
And I had an injury, but I'm still able and considered able to work. And but that knocked me into a lower field where I have to do office work now, no real hard physical work like I used to.
All right, we appreciate your call. Any response, Susan Ferricchio?
Yeah, it's really interesting. You know, I was just talking to Senator Dianne Feinstein over in the Senate, and as you may know, California has a really high unemployment rate. And she was talking just about this, that she said if you're not in what we call the STEM fields, which is science, technology, engineering, or math, which are the high-paying and hard-to-fill jobs in the U.S., it's really hard to find a job. You know, it's hard for people to find a job, particularly if you are, you know, if you're not in retirement or nearing retirement in your 40s, 50s, 60s. It can be so hard to get back into the workforce if you're out with an injury or if you're laid off. And that's part of the issue, because some of the jobs just aren't there anymore. And that's truly a dilemma here in the U.S. that, like I say, here in Congress, they try to grapple with. What I think you're going to see here legislatively is a larger discussion about training and trying to put money into training people so that they can start applying and be able to get these jobs that are out there. Because let's face it, we have fewer manufacturing jobs here in the U.S. because manufacturing is going overseas, is going elsewhere. And so it's really these STEM jobs that are becoming the jobs that are open and available, yet not everybody is cut out for them. They don't have the training for it.
Let's get one more quick call as the vote's wrapping up. Suitland, Maryland, back to Reginald on our Democrats line. Go ahead.
How are you doing today? I'm Reginald Harrod. That's Harrod, and I agree with that past caller who just called in. Everything she said is correct. Everything she said is what I was going to say about the past jobs, the training,
Reginald, having a little trouble hearing you. Sorry about that. We appreciate your call and all our calls, and we appreciate Susan Ferricchio, Chief Congressional Correspondent for Washington Examiner, joining us up on Capitol Hill. You can read her reporting at WashingtonExaminer.com and also on Twitter. Follow her on Twitter as well. Thanks for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
On this vote, the yeas are 228 and the nays are 195, and the previous question is ordered. The question is on the adoption of the amendment. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it, the ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. The question is on the adoption of the resolution as amended. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed say no. The question of the chair, gentleman from Massachusetts.
Madam Speaker, on that I ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested, and those favoring a recorded vote will rise. A sufficient number having arisen, a recorded vote is ordered, and members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 5-minute vote.